to the actual society of what the vampires really are. And it kind of gets into, like, it's really, really, again, catching the modern times without knowing, because now everyone's worrying about conspiracies. And it's just like this idea of who's behind the door, who's actually pulling the strings. And
well, I know you've been writing this for quite some time. To me, you've just described Roger Stone. And I know that wasn't your intent. Am I right or am I wrong?
When I saw him, so the funny thing is, when I saw him get released, I was just like, definitely vampires.
and you know, the run-of-the-mill Republican with the open marriage, with the doing the weird stuff.
Absolutely. Right.
This is Roger Stone.
Very much so.
But again, this is not, this is almost, you didn't copy Roger Stone. It just so happens that Roger Stone, which is why I say this book, while it's fantasy, man, it's based in fact.
Right. I mean, I basically kind of, there's a few things but I generally use the actual events of 1990 to 1993.
Right.
And it gets into, if you have a society that has power behind, what limits that power? What do they get out of it? Because the thing about it is, people talk about, there's, we used to have these debates about there's the rich people, or there's a group of rich people controlling everything. And I always say to people, well, even if that's true, they're still human beings. They still have limitations. And people get mad at me.
Right.
I said, I don't believe that there is a society of people running everything, because human beings can't agree on that level. If you get 50 rich people, whatever the heck, the Masons, the Skulls, the Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, they're still human beings.
The Trilateralists, the Bilderbergers.
It doesn't matter. Once you get over, you might be able to get 2 or 3 people to be on the same page as far as ultimate power for a couple years. Even then, as you progress and as you realize you're not challenged by anyone else, then I believe, and this is kind of what I get into in the book, as you are faced with less and less obstacles from everyone else, the people who are on your level become more and more the adversary. I believe it's a natural. I think we have a natural conflictual aspect to our psyche. We have to have a challenge. We have to have the prospect to lose. So what people would be saying is, there's someone who's in power, and they control everything, and no matter what happens, it works out the way they want. And I would tell people that's hell. Nobody would want that.
Right.
And they go, what do you mean? If human beings don't have a challenge, we're dead socially and spiritually.
That's true.
And so that's really what
and men more than women, in my opinion.
Interesting you say that. Because that's dealt with in the book. When he's brought into the Vampire Society, and there's different clans, different tribes that have emerged, but it's 1991, so the elders they hold power through the conventional means. They basically run the world by having a group of people who know they exist, who they're bound to by blood. They're called the Bound. So they're human beings. They take the vampire's blood, and they're sort of compelled to do what the vampire, so they're not a risk to tell anybody that they exist because of a process. So basically the situation is, if you're a 400-year-old vampire, okay, or 300-year-old vampire, you're not going to be taking computer classes in 1973.
Right. Exactly.
So you're going to need, and this actually comes from how things work in historical society. The historical power bases, whether it's the Romanovs or the Kennedys, whoever, they have to have gradations of people under them that know how the world works today. And it's the same thing goes on with politics. The Republicans, for Trump to win, he's going to have to find some young people who think the way he thinks, who can make him successful in the electoral sense. Obama the same way. It doesn't matter, because times change, and you're always going to be a creation of your era.
And not only that, but old people used to be young people.
Mm-hmm.
But two things: people change,
Mm-hmm.
and times change.
Right.
So, if you're 60, you're not 30.
Right.
And 30 years ago, when you were 30, it's not like now. So whatever was going on then is not going on now. So the 60-year-old not only is not anything like the 30-year-old, but the times are usually nothing like the 30-year-old. So the young are the young. And they'll always be unique.
And that's something we get into. As a vampire, if you're created in 1753, it doesn't matter that you're living forever or whatever. The fact is that your mind, you're still a person who grew up with, let's say you got turned in 22 years. So it's 1770, whatever.
Sure.
You're still that person. It's 1991. Sure, you're able to process on a kinetic level what's going on, but you're still that person whose sense of reality, your formative years are 1771. You really can't process. And this is just what I believe. Because in a lot of the other vampire movies, they make these vampires and they're just, every 100 years, they're just swinging. They get it.
Right.
To me, that's implausible. If you were born in 1771 and you lived 130 years as a powerful vampire, whatever, your experiences are shaped by being a 14-year-old boy that can't get that woman, that girl, because the 17-year-old guy in 1771 pushed you down.
Right.
That's who you are.
Sure.
You can't then turn around and be in 1921. Oh, now I'm this guy. No.
You're still the same human being.
You're the
same being, I guess.
But when you were young then, that's what formed you.
Sure.
What you do as a vampire is still going to be guided by how you were as a human being in 1751. You see what I'm saying?
Sure. So the vampires can't relate to today's time.
Not really.
So they rely on the bound ones.
The vampire class, that's the political power class does. I mean, there's different, and they also rely on, that's why they create new vampires, because you still need to have a class of actual vampires, because they generally don't want to create new vampires for obvious reasons. Because you get too many vampires, you got a problem.
Sure. You can't hide in the shadows anymore because there's not enough shadows in which to hide.
Right.
But now these bound ones, then, they're not vampires per se.
No.
But why wouldn't they just come out and spill the beans?
One, they basically can't.
Because the vampires have this on them?
Well, because when they take, so the bound, what happens is they take blood from the vampire. It doesn't turn them into a vampire. The creation of a vampire is a much more involved process, which is interesting because in this vampire society, and like I said, I just amalgamated different things as opposed to just, created some.
So if the bound take the blood from the vampires, it doesn't turn them into a vampire. However,
it keeps them from aging, and
they probably get a high from it or something. There's a reason why they do it.
Yeah, the first few times they get addicted to it,
right? And
they have to get some every so often. But
so they found this thing through the vampires that really turns them on.
Yeah.
They're indebted to the vampires because they want to continue with this thing that really turns them on, but they really can't go to the authorities because then they have to raise their hand and say, we've done something wrong.
Well, and not only that, but so if...
And I mentioned that for one reason, because I'm going to throw another thing out here.
Okay.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Yep.
There you go. And again, when you start reading this, there was no Jeffrey Epstein in the news.
And that's the other part, is that it's basically a death sentence because humans aren't supposed to know about it. And there's something called the secret.
Right.
And any human that technically, so there's your local coven. And the Chicago coven is the biggest one in the nation because there's so much money in Chicago. But then you have the grand society, the high chamber, that lords over the vampires in the world. And there's also a rival clan too that some people don't even know exists, but they do exist. And they have their vision of overthrowing the vampire nation, and they're the bad guys from the perspective of the vampire nation, or whatever the nation,
So, but they're both vampires.
Yeah, they're vampires, but there's one. Basically, there's the establishment, and then there's the other, what you would call like the way people look at it. To the vampires, are terrorists, but to them, they're like a hardcore religious cult. And they basically believe they're not happy with the vampires today because the vampires today basically they're basically sellouts to them. So they're called the Nazarene, and it's a Latin word for the sect.
Okay.
And they're like the Vampire Nation is deep cover. Like nobody knows they exist for the most part. Well, that's what we think. The Nazarene are even deeper than that. You know, they're deep beyond the layers where the Vampire Nation are. So the Nazarene are vampires, but they're different from these vampires that the Jack Kemp-like character Republican is involved in. Yes. But they're along the same lines. They're just diametrically opposed to. They're ideologically opposed, and they're a lot more they're a lot more primal in their perspective. They're a religious sect. They're religious zealots. Again, you know what this sounds like to me? Democrats and Republicans. Yep. See how this? See what we're doing here? This is when you talk about a book about vampires, you can't say it's 100% fiction, right? Because you can always tie stuff in, right, from today's world, right? But I was focusing on, and I started this all in 3 years ago, and so one of the things that this Robert Faulkner discovers, so he's told that he's a vampire after this phone call, and they basically have like. So he's a vampire, not a bound one. No, he's a full vampire. Okay, yeah, and he's a vampire created. They're called the Venturi. The Venturi are the political class vampires, and they are. So there's different alliances. There's 2 or 3 houses of vampires that, they're all together in the same house. Like there's. The nation vampires, there's about 5 or 6, and I call them gens, which is another Latin word for clan or for house or for tribe or whatever. So what you have is, and they have different abilities, sort of, but they also have different roles. That's sort of one of the futuristic dystopian thing where you have the one house where the people are the smart ones, then you have the warrior clan, and it's kind of like that. Where this political class, they're definitely hard. They're definitely what you would call the donor class or the capitalists or whatever. And their 2 things are, they're pretty tough and they have mind control. You know, they're the only vampires who can mind control their vampires. There's a few other vampires who can learn how to do it depending on if they get with the right group, but they're the only vampires who can control the minds of other vampires, which is why they're in the highest position. Because even if you're stronger even if you're a better warrior, because there's another couple warrior clans, but if you can control someone's mind, it's really, really difficult to beat a group of people who can make you do what you want them to do. Because you can be a great warrior if they can plant something in your head. You're going to go ahead and turn on your own people. And because these Venturi have most of the money, they don't usually do their own fighting. They do exactly they hire a bunch of bound who are basically. They hire proxies. They hire proxies. They hire human proxies, or they hire what you call the bound, or, they create ghouls. They create minions to do most of their fighting. And they're a little bit tougher than humans, but there's a lot of them. Now these vampires, they've been around for a long time. Yes. Is their goal to run society, stay in the shadows, and do their own thing? What's their goal? And that's what Robert Faulkner, that his journey is figuring all this out. Because the reason why he was changed is because what happens is no one's really supposed to make new vampires, but they did. They do every couple decades or every couple 10 years or whatever. And they create some excuse to do it because in general it's considered a risk. But he was picked because they needed a class of bureaucrats. And from what the person... A modern-day bureaucrat. Right. He was picked to be a follower. He was picked to be... Because he wasn't the best lawyer, but what he was known for is he was really diplomatic. He was very good at figuring out how to connect the dots. He was able to get the right-wing people. And the reason why... It's fun. The reason why he gets turned to a vampire is he's Republican, but he does not like